Usually when we talk about cooking down ingredients, there's this expectation of total erasure. Like a soup, right?
Right, yeah, like everything just melts together.
Exactly. Throw in carrots, onions, some spices, you boil it for hours. And eventually, the chef just points to the pot and says, there it is, the broth. Everything melted together, totally uniform and homogeneous.
It's a very comforting image, I think, the idea of total cohesion where everyone blends perfectly into one single unified thing.
Yeah, but then you step into the real lived history of the United States, and that soup pot just goes right out the window. So today we are doing a deep dive into a really brilliant source. It's called Land of Many Shores, the 250-year journey by Professor Dr. Milton Biswas.
And his core argument in this book completely reframes how we look at American identity, especially as we approach the nation's 250th anniversary in 2026.
Right, and the mission for us today is to really get into that paradigm shift. The thesis here is that America is not a melting pot that erases differences. It is a dynamic, ever-expanding mosaic where each piece, retains its sharp, vibrant edges.
Which is such a great way to look at it, because Biswas argues that to understand the modern American landscape, you have to look at how those very first tiles of the mosaic were laid down.
Yeah, and free listening, you've probably filled out a census form at some point and checked a box for your hyphenated heritage, or maybe just grab a fusion taco from a food truck.
Definitely.
Understanding the mechanics of this mosaic is really the ultimate shortcut to decoding how those everyday realities actually came to be, because the foundation is honestly entirely misunderstood.
It really is. The traditional narrative leaves so much out.
I always had this assumption, probably from high school history, that early America was purely a British Anglo-Protestant monolith.
Oh, absolutely. Most people do.
Right. You picture the Pilgrims, the British crown, and you just assume they copy-pasted English common law across the colonies. But the source text dismantles that right away. It details 3 massive, non-British pillars that were already laying the groundwork. I knew about the Dutch being in New York, but Biswas frames their presence entirely differently than just a competing colony.
Yeah, because they weren't trying to build a religious utopia like the Puritans were.
Oh, interesting.
The Dutch in New Netherland, they brought mercantile capitalism. They utilized joint stock financing to fund their expeditions.
It was just business.
Exactly. Their primary goal was commerce, specifically establishing the fur trade. And that required forming complex trade partnerships with indigenous populations. They essentially made pluralism a business strategy.
Wow, okay.
Tolerating different languages and faiths wasn't necessarily a moral stance for them. It was simply good for the bottom line.
So they are setting an economic precedent.
Oh.
But the book also heavily features the Germans, and it introduces a term I had literally never heard of, the Schützenverein.
Yes. The shooting clubs.
Right. It translates to shooting clubs. But the text claims these were actually the blueprint for American civic infrastructure.
Yeah, it's fascinating. They started as localized militias or shooting clubs in German-speaking lands. But when they were imported to the colonies, they evolved into crucial civic organizations.
How so?
Well, because early colonial governments were incredibly weak, right? So these German community hubs stepped in to provide an early ethos of communal social welfare.
Oh, like a safety net.
Exactly. They organized bilingual education and created local safety nets to care for the vulnerable. They effectively built the first non-governmental civic institution.
Okay, let's unpack this, because then we also have the French, who are operating mostly on the frontiers and in the South.
Right, Louisiana and those areas.
Yeah, and Biswas points out their contribution wasn't just cultural fusion like the Cajun communities, but a fundamentally different legal framework. It's why Louisiana still uses the Napoleonic Code today instead of English common law.
Which is a huge structural difference.
It is. So think of the early colonies not as a strict British franchise, but almost like a chaotic corporate joint venture where the Dutch handled the finance, the French handled the frontier diplomacy, and the Germans built the local civic infrastructure.
What's fascinating here is how accurate that joint venture framework is. Because you had these completely different systems operating simultaneously, early colonial governance had to figure out how to accommodate them all.
They couldn't just tell everyone what to do.
Exactly. You couldn't just rule by absolute decree. It created a society that became inherently comfortable with negotiated power.
Makes sense.
You had merchant councils having to balance economic interests against the civic welfare models the Germans were building. It really prefigured aspects of American republicanism.
The idea that multiple groups have to coexist.
Right, the understanding that multiple communities with competing interests could coexist under a flexible political umbrella.
But the source requires us to make a really difficult pivot here, because the economic engine those voluntary European settlers built was scaling up really fast, and it required massive amounts of labor.
It did. And that brings us to the darkest part of the foundation.
Yeah, we have to confront the darkest, most foundational tiles of the mosaic: forced migration. The mosaic wasn't just built by those seeking freedom, but by those completely stripped of it.
The transatlantic slave trade.
Exactly. The source details the horrors of the Middle Passage, noting these staggering 15 to 20% mortality rates. It created this brutal paradox of a nation professing liberty while codifying human bondage, which obviously leads directly to the Civil War.
It is the defining paradox of the American experiment.
But Biswas pushes back on how the agricultural history of the South is typically taught. When we talk about the agricultural history of the South, we usually just talk about the physical labor of enslaved people.
Right, the sheer muscle.
Right. But this source insists we need to reclassify this as imported intellectual property and agricultural engineering. Why is that distinction so critical to his thesis?
Because it completely changes the paradigm of who actually built the wealth of the nation. Enslaved Africans are too often framed in historical narratives merely as passive victims of forced labor.
Right, just hands in a field.
Exactly. But Biswas details the complex agricultural engineering required to make the South profitable. Take the vast wetlands of South Carolina and Georgia, for instance.
Okay.
You cannot just throw seeds into a swamp and expect a cash crop. That's not how it works. Enslaved workers from West Africa brought centuries of accumulated, highly specialized knowledge about tidal rice cultivation.
He mentions sluice gates specifically in the book. How did that work?
Oh, it was incredible. They engineered intricate systems of canals, dikes, and these wooden sluice gates called trunks that harnessed the natural tidal flow of the rivers.
So they were using the ocean tides.
Yes. As the tide came in, it pushed fresh river water up, which they captured to flood the rice fields. When the tide went out, they opened the gates to drain them.
Wow.
It was a massive feat of hydrological engineering, entirely reliant on West African expertise. They literally turned inhospitable swamps into the economic engines of the American colonies.
And beyond the engineering, they introduced new crops entirely.
Right. Things like okra and black-eyed peas, which fundamentally altered what we now consider Southern cuisine.
And that intellectual property argument extends to the cultural landscape too, right? The source details how slaveholders systematically tried to erase African culture, even banning the use of drums to prevent communication and rebellion.
Yes, the erasure was violent and systemic, yet the rhythmic complexity survived anyway.
How did they manage that without instruments?
Enslaved people maintain West African polyrhythms, which is when multiple contrasting rhythms are played simultaneously by adapting to body percussion, clapping, stomping, using their own bodies.
That's amazing.
And they preserved the call-and-response vocal structures in the fields. Those specific musical architectures became the absolute bedrock of spirituals, work songs, the blues, jazz, and eventually modern hip-hop.
So despite a system designed to completely dehumanize them, they were active architects of America's cultural and economic wealth.
Exactly.
So, okay, the national economy is scaling rapidly, powered heavily by that forced agricultural engineering in the South and the booming industries in the North. And to connect it all, America needs infrastructure.
Canals, railroads, the literal foundations.
Right. We're in the mid-19th century now, and those physical foundations were built by refugees of European desperation.
Primarily the Irish, who were fleeing on Gortimore, the Great Hunger.
The potato famine.
Right. Over 1 million people escaping starvation and political collapse on these incredibly dangerous coffin ships.
Most of us know the basics of the famine, but Biswas zeroes in on the fierce nativist hostility they faced when they arrived. I mean, they were doing the grueling work of digging the Erie Canal and laying the Eastern Railroad tracks, but they were treated as a dangerous underclass.
The hostility was intense.
The source explains they survived by leveraging Catholicism. How do they turn a religion into a survival mechanism?
Well, because they were excluded from broader Protestant society, the Irish built deeply rooted urban Catholic communities. We aren't just talking about places of worship here.
What else did they build?
They built parallel institutional shields, their own parochial schools, their own hospitals, and their own orphanages.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was a massive network of institutional infrastructure that protected them against nativist discrimination.
At the same time, you have the German 48ers arriving, the They're also refugees, but the text draws a really sharp contrast between them and the Irish.
A very sharp contrast. The 48ers were political refugees fleeing the failed 1848 democratic revolutions across the German states.
So they weren't fleeing famine.
No, unlike the Irish, who were largely impoverished tenant farmers, the German arrivals included highly skilled artisans, journalists, and progressive intellectuals.
And they brought a totally different political energy.
Absolutely. They brought radical democratic ideals and strong abolitionist sentiments. They formed these organizations called Turnverein.
Right, the text mentioned those. Gymnastics clubs.
Outwardly, yes, they were gymnastic and cultural clubs. But internally, they functioned as intense hubs for political debate and labor organizing.
Okay, so let me make sure I have this straight. The Irish essentially provided the physical, muscle, and institutional Catholic backbone for the expanding cities, while the German 48ers injected a highly organized progressive political toolkit into the American workforce.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, both groups proved something essential about the mosaic.
Which is?
They proved that immigrants could create insular, protective ethnic neighborhoods preserving their faith, their language, while simultaneously driving the broader nation's industrial and political expansion. Assimilation didn't require total erasure.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the explosive Ellis Island wave. The canals and railroads built by the Irish and Germans allowed massive industrial cities to rise, which drew millions more from southern and eastern Europe.
The era of the Golden Door?
Yes, but the source details how terrifying that door actually was. The intimidating Ellis Island process. The grueling medical inspections, the fear of a doctor putting a chalk mark on your coat that could mean instant deportation.
It was a very clinical, scary process.
And for the Italians who made it through, Biswas mentions they often fell into peonage labor traps. What exactly is peonage?
It was essentially a system of debt slavery.
Wait.
Yeah. Southern Italians fleeing intense poverty would often secure passage through a padrone, which is a labor broker. The padrone would pay for their ticket, but the immigrant was then trapped working off an inflated, impossible debt.
Doing what kind of work?
Usually brutal manual labor on construction sites or in mines. It was a terrible exploitative trap. But despite this, Italian immigrants forged tight-knit little Italies and completely transformed urban public life.
Oh, with the food, right.
Exactly, taking humble street foods like pizza and turning them into American staples, and claiming public space through massive religious celebrations like the Feast of San Gennaro.
And then you have Eastern European Jews fleeing violent pogroms, settling in places like New York's Lower East Side. The book spends a lot of time on the foreword, the Yiddish newspaper.
Such an important publication.
I always assumed foreign language papers just kept people tethered to the old country.
It did the exact opposite. The foreword was an incredible mechanism for assimilation through the native tongue.
How so?
It explained American democratic processes, it taught immigrants how to unionize against sweatshop conditions, and even had advice columns on how to navigate American social norms. And all of it was published in Yiddish.
That's brilliant.
It allowed them to engage with American civic duties without abandoning their cultural identity, just as Polish and Greek immigrants were doing by forming mutual aid societies.
Like the Polish patches in Greek towns.
Right, backed by groups like the Polish National Alliance and AHIPA, providing life insurance and community support.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because this era is the birth of the hyphenated American. But Biswas notes that the hyphen was intensely controversial back then.
Very controversial.
We take terms like Italian-American for granted now. But back then, wasn't the hyphen heavily criticized as a sign of divided loyalty? A refusal to fully assimilate?
Yes, nativists argued that a hyphenated identity meant you weren't fully committed to the United States. But Biswas argues the hyphen was actually a badge of survival and a dynamic synthesis.
A synthesis.
Yeah, it was a negotiation tool. The hyphen meant you could speak Yiddish or Italian at the dinner table, preserve your ancestral roots, and still walk out the door to vote in an American election or lead a labor strike. It proved you could participate fully in civic life while honoring your roots.
But, while European immigrants are negotiating the power of the hyphen in the East, the source forces us to look at the West Coast, where Asian immigrants were facing an entirely different, heavily restricted reality.
A completely different world legally.
Right. Chinese laborers made up 80% of the Central Pacific Railroad workforce. They were the ones handling nitroglycerin to blast through the solid granite of the Sierra Nevada.
It was incredibly lethal work. They were literally carving the path for the 1869 Golden Spike, that connected the eastern and western rail networks.
And it is a staggering contradiction that the exact people who physically connected the two halves of the continent were the first to be legally excluded from belonging to it.
It really is. Biswas highlights the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act as a profound paradox.
And just a quick reminder for our listeners, we are strictly reporting the facts of the legislation and history exactly as Biswas presents them in the source.
Right. The Chinese Exclusion Act marks the first major American law to restrict immigration explicitly based on nationality and race. It barred Chinese laborers from entering the country and legally prevented those already here from naturalizing as citizens.
Literally a legal wall built as a direct reward for their foundational labor.
Exactly.
And the restrictions just keep expanding. Japanese immigrants arrive for agricultural and contract labor in Hawaii and the West Coast, and they eventually face the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907.
Which effectively choked off Japanese labor immigration.
And later, during World War II, Executive Order 9066 authorizes the forced internment of Japanese Americans. But the text is very clear that these communities did not just passively accept the legal walls being built around them.
No, they didn't. This raises an important question about how the law functions. It can be an instrument of oppression, but it can also be a battlefield for rights.
How did they fight back?
Asian immigrants utilized the American judicial system itself. In the landmark 1886 Supreme Court case Yekwo v. Hopkins, Chinese immigrants successfully argued for equal protection.
Right, that a law enforced discriminatorily is unconstitutional.
Yes. Then you have Takao Ozawa v. United States challenging racial citizenship hierarchies. Organizations like the Japanese American Citizens League and Chinese benevolent associations utilize the courts to fight for their humanity.
So we have this intense xenophobia and exclusionary mindset brewing out west. And the source tracks how it eventually swallows the entire country by 1924.
A massive turning point.
The federal government passes the Immigration Act of 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act. And Biswas points out this wasn't just about slowing down immigration. It was heavily influenced by the eugenics movement.
It was.
How did eugenics actually inform a border policy?
The mechanism they used was the census. The architects of the 1924 Act deliberately set strict national origin quotas based on the 1890 census data.
Why 1890 specifically?
Because that was right before the massive waves of Southern and Eastern Europeans arrived. By tying the quotas to older demographic data, they legally engineered a system designed to freeze the ethnic makeup of the country, favoring Northern Europeans and slamming the door on Asians and Southern and Eastern Europeans.
Reading this section, I kept picturing a balloon. I mean, it's like the country squeezed a balloon. By aggressively pinching off the external flow of European and Asian labor, the economic pressure simply forced a massive internal movement from the rural South to the urban North.
That balloon analogy is perfect. That economic pressure triggered the Great Migration.
6 million African Americans moving.
Yes, with foreign labor cut off and wartime industries booming, 6 million African Americans fled the violent segregation and Jim Crow laws of the South, drawn to northern and midwestern cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Harlem.
And this internal movement fundamentally rewires American culture. I mean, it births the Harlem Renaissance. Langston Hughes or Neil Hurston, Duke Ellington. It brings the blues and jazz to the urban North.
It was a massive cultural explosion. But the text doesn't shy away from the collision that happened in these cities.
Right, because the old enclaves were already there.
Exactly. This massive influx of African-American migrants collided directly with the older European ethnic enclaves. This led to redlining and deep spatial segregation. But simultaneously, this movement laid the deep, organized foundations for the civil rights movement.
So the borders were slammed shut in 1924. But Biswas notes that it takes an unprecedented global catastrophe to force those closed-door policies open again.
World War II.
Right. We move to the aftermath of the war. Millions of people are displaced. Holocaust survivors in Europe, ethnic expulsions, the partition of India, the division of Korea.
The sheer scale of global displacement was staggering.
And it forces the U.S. to pass the Displaced Persons Act of 1948, shifting U.S. policy toward ideological sanctuary during the Cold War.
Yes. And Biswas emphasizes that it was deeply shaped by the refugees themselves. Jewish survivors brought the concept of tikkun olam, repairing the world. They actively linked their trauma to broader American human rights and civil rights advocacy.
So what does this all mean? We started by talking about economic migrants and forced labor, but post-WWII, it seems the very definition of an immigrant shifted in the American psyche. Did we stop seeing them just as labor and start seeing them as a moral imperative?
That is exactly the shift. Holocaust survivors and displaced persons transformed America from a mere destination for opportunity into a formalized geopolitical sanctuary.
They forced the issue.
They did. This era leads directly to the 1951 Refugee Convention and the principle of non-refoulement, which forbids returning refugees to danger. They actively shaped international human rights laws.
It's an incredible 250-year journey. From Dutch merchants and enslaved African agriculturalists to Irish canal diggers, Chinese railroad workers, internal migrants, and WWII refugees.
And the ultimate takeaway from the book is that the American mosaic is never finished. It is an active, ongoing process.
So to you, listening to this right now, the next time you walk down a city street, or smell a fusion food truck, or hear a blend of musical genres, you are witnessing the exact legacy of this 250-year migration story playing out in real time.
Every piece of that mosaic is right there.
But Biswas leaves us with a final lingering question to ponder. If American identity has always been forged by the specific crises and migrations of the past 250 years, what will happen the next 250 years?
A very good question.
How might the unprecedented global climate-driven migrations of the future force us to invent entirely new hyphens, cultural fusions, and definitions of belonging that we can't even imagine today? Something to think about.